Well, welcome to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. I'm your host, Big Tom Perkins, along with Dr. Cameron Meyerly. And I think today we thought maybe we'd talk about the 5 soil health principles. Is that correct?
Yeah, as we had mentioned there a couple weeks ago, we'd like to get into some more soil health parameters and just why we graze the way we're grazing, or why would we change the way we're grazing in our operation outside of animal performance. And so, as we had mentioned, planning on interviewing some soil scientists, some experts in that field, similar to what we've done on some other sheep related topics, but ultimately it's very difficult or impossible to raise livestock without that soil, or to do anything without that soil. It doesn't matter if we're in a confinement operation or extensively grazing. It's at the root, pun intended, of our success. And so, Tom, this is something that you've paid attention to for a while now,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and you've had a lot of interest in it, and have mentioned in here kind of what you're doing in the reclamation process of the home farm. And uh and you know you've talked about that and the improvements that you've seen by implementing those grazing strategies and making those soil health principles kind of come to life. So as we get started, uh, the first, and you mentioned five, and I'm not sure, would you have the name of the individual that would have come up with this, for like original concept of this, or at
I
least put it in writing?
well, I would think those that made it uh, kind of famous, I guess, would be guys like Ray Archuleta and Gabe Brown and oh, the fella in Carrollton, Ohio. I can never think what his name is, but he was the fellow that Gabe Brown and Ray Archuleta learned from. He's from Carrollton, Ohio. I can't think of his name now. Dave Brandt.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
okay. and
We
and we just want to be upfront, and we did not come up with the principles of soil health. This is regurgitation of material, but we feel it's important to discuss as sheep producers, as sheep grazers. This is what we're doing, and this is what ties us back to the land. And I think we're already at an advantage, and we'll get to that principle of animal impact, but we're already at an advantage because, Tom, you used to raise some cows
yep.
alongside your sheep. In terms of animal impact, sheep leave a whole lot of soil disturbance behind after grazing on some wet ground.
Nope, not like the cows did.
No, it's terrible. And I mean, that to me, you're raising larger ruminant species in Ohio is one of the biggest uh, just downsides to the cattle side of things.
Yep.
Uh, is the overwintering process. We don't freeze. There's a couple things that go into it. We don't get a as hard of a freeze as what we see in some other parts of the country around the world. Uh, we also don't have the large tracts of land to distribute that animal weight over a longer period of time. And so our animal weight tends to be more concentrated out on some softer ground during the winter, high moisture, and we can see quite a bit of soil damage and soil disturbance. But probably getting a little ahead of ourselves, if we start with that first soil health principle, and my principles are coming off, they only have four, and we'll add that fifth one in there, but are coming directly from NRCS, from the USDA. And that first principle is soil armor. So I'll ask you, Tom, when you're thinking about soil armor, yeah, it's a pretty robust description of of what we see looking down at that ground. What does it mean to you?
It means to me that I can look down anywhere I'm walking, whether I've grazed sheep there yet or not, and I don't want to see any bare soil. None whatsoever. You should never be able to look down and see bare soil. Um, and it's funny because, we'll have places where we have tracks, from driving across the field too much. and there'd be bare soil there. And I had a neighbor over this summer when we were contemplating being able to graze some of his ground, and I just showed him that difference between soil that was covered, soil that had an armor on it, and soil that wasn't. And that was that real dry spell there in the spring. And you could see these little clover plants coming up where that soil was open, and you could see the soil, and those plants just got up just a tiny bit, and they were wilting because they were so dry. And then you take a couple steps over to where you had some good matted grass down there as a soil armor, and those plants looked fantastic. And I had him take his fingernail and get down in there that where there was the exposed soil, and that soil was just rock hard. And then we went over a few steps to where we had that soil armor on there, and he couldn't get over the difference in how much cooler it felt and how much softer that ground was. It had moisture in it. But you want that armor on there for a number of different reasons. One is just the sun can't beat down on it and heat it up. That's another thing. You go out there with a thermometer, and on that bare soil, it'll be 10 or 15 degrees warmer than what your ambient temperature is. And you go in that covered soil, and it'll be 15 to 20 degrees cooler than what the ambient temperature is. And then not only
Right. And
keep,
the
yeah,
reason that's important is a couple of factors.
soil
And so
biology.
when we're soil biology, we have an optimum temperature for activity. And if we relate this back to common sheep situations or production cycles, we think about parasites,
Yep.
and where they have an optimum temperature, an optimum activity temperature. And
Hmm.
so, if and correct me if I'm wrong, but for our soil biology, they're in that, especially that top portion of the soil, we're looking in that 70s
Yeah,
degree
I've
Fahrenheit
heard.
range.
Yep, I've heard you get much over 80, and that soil biology starts to die down.
Right. It
It
burns up.
it
I
burns up. It
and I don't
can't.
know if that's an accurate description, but uh, again, it's just like livestock. As we heat things up, we reduce our ability to graze efficiently.
Yep.
And uh, the other aspect of that sun beating down, access to those UV rays, evaporation.
Yep.
That heating up of that bare soil, creating the evaporation of those water molecules. And
Yeah,
again,
just
I,
dries your soil out.
exactly. And so what's the value of having that water left in that ground?
It makes your grass grow.
Growth. Yeah, those are kind of the two primary things that we need for to grow grass, whether we're grazing or we live in a suburb and we're just mowing all the time. We need rain and we need sunlight. And so if we can keep as much of that water there as possible, it tends to be beneficial for us. And so, back to the soil armor, fancy way, and I like that term because it provides this visual picture of what we'd like to see. It's not just cover, because I feel like cover, when we're thinking about just the word itself, it doesn't have an action associated with it other than to lay over something.
Yeah.
Armor makes it sound like an actual activity that it's there to have a purpose other than just laying over the ground, covering it up. And so when we're thinking about uh, the temperature and evaporation, another big one would be erosion. So whether it's wind erosion or water erosion, we know we need that cover. We need that armor there for those two types of erosion. And had a colleague there at Penn State, did his master's work down at Auburn, I believe, with cover crops, and he and I had a couple discussions um, on best use for cover crops. And I'm a big fan of kind of double cropping
Mhm.
those, utilizing them. For me, it's hard to just say that it's out there on cropland. It's out there just to hold the soil in place. And I know that's important. But if it can do that right up until we're going to plant that row crop in the spring, and then I can take it off for animal feed, or I can put animals on it and graze it shortly before that planting window. And he was adamant. He's like, well, if I do that and it rains, think about all the disturbance that we're going to have from that rain. And that's what a lot of his work was on, was looking at the, I guess, the physical impact of a rain droplet on soil. And we don't think about it, even in a light rain or a heavy rain. It's like, oh, it's raining, we're getting wet. But you go down to the soil level, and on bare soil, it is aggressive. Yeah,
Oh,
I mean, it is
it's like a little bomb going off.
it is, and all of that uh, damage or impact from that water, we then have those soil particles, and that portion of the soil is topsoil,
Mm.
the stuff that we'd like to keep.
Yep.
We then have that free floating. If we get enough water, where does it end up?
Yeah, it just runs off your fields.
Right. Yeah, and for you,
Not to
I mean, you
mention that,
gotta.
but that little crater that it makes when that water droplet hits, and I've seen tons of videos on this. It is absolutely amazing. But it is like a little crater from a bomb. And then the inside of that crater from that bomb of that raindrop is so hard now that water won't penetrate it anymore.
Isn't that incredible?
And so the next drop of water that hits near it and runs down into it just lays there. And so you have a teeny tiny little puddle. The next little bit of water that runs into that is just going to run off. And
Or
and now
evaporate.
or evaporate. Now you can get an inch of rain, and how much of it actually stayed in your field? The
So
vast
what is
majority.
that principle, not soil principle, but that hard center where that raindrop, what would that be called?
I don't know what that's called. Wasted
Compaction.
opportunity, as far as I'm concerned.
Wait,
Oh,
so
it
wasted
would be compaction.
exactly.
Yeah, you're right. It would be compaction.
Yeah, and that's,
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't trying to trip you up. But it's crazy when we think about compaction, do we ever think about rainfall as a large contributor?
No, back, when I used to raise corn, I would go out and cultivate before a rain came, thinking I was loosening the soil up so that the water, the rain could go down in. And in reality, all I was doing was creating an area so that that rain could come down, hit all that bare soil, just make it hard as a rock, and all the water would run off.
Yeah, and that's
The other part of that soil armor is it acts like a sponge. You get that all that tramped down grass in there, and it just sucks that water up like crazy. It breaks up that raindrop, so instead of one drop, it becomes a bunch of little droplets that just kind of wick their way down slowly into the soil. But now, somebody will call me up and ask me how much rain I got, and I tell them every bit of it.
right. Right. And back to the compaction aspect of it. So when we're thinking about compaction, and you mentioned the cultivating point, and I've got a story to share on that is telling to this point.
Hmm.
But when we're thinking about compaction, first thing you think about on the farm, would you say livestock, or would you say uh, motorized equipment?
Yeah, I'm always thinking tractors, manure spreaders,
Right.
heavy stuff.
It, and it's and that's our operations. It's a big thing when we're thinking row crop ground, uh, tillage equipment, harvesting equipment, that grain cart. And what's interesting, there's whole research projects, grant funded research that
Oh yeah.
will look at tire engineering, how much pressure we put in certain types of tires and how much compaction it creates over so many like that. To me is crazy. But it's something that, even in those areas of production, we know that we need to take a look at it because it's detrimental to our soil productivity, our soil health. But on the compaction point and your rain point and bare soil, I was working for a company up in Worcester, a swine operation, and they had just planted some soybeans in um, in a conventional tillage situation, and so we have bare earth, planted soybeans, and hard rain had just come. So much so that they have an implement, and I believe if I'm remembering correctly, it would be considered a rotary hoe.
Okay.
And uh, so all it looks like is a bunch of little tines
Yep.
on a wheel
Yep.
that are spaced pretty closely together. And all it's doing is it looks uh, very similar to what your um, rototiller would look like that you use in your garden. And all it's doing is rolling across the top of that field and busting up the sod. And mind you, ground's been planted, seed is in the ground, and the concern was if they didn't bust the crust up that had formed from this bare earth and rain compaction, that those seeds would not be able to bend themselves out to break through that crust
Yeah, I
to
believe it.
to come out of the ground. And
Yeah, I
this
believe
is something like they're not the only ones that have that have ever had to do it. They make an implement specifically for this. And I think it just goes to reiterate that point that rainfall is aggressive.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, and when we have bare earth, what does that look like? Uh, have you ever had to go out and bust the sod, bust the crust up on your in your pasture? Hopefully, you don't have a
Nope.
whole lot of soil crusting over in your grazing allotments. Um,
No, but
but
it is amazing how much harder that anywhere you can find a bare spot, how much harder that soil is. I mean, you just do it with your fingernail, you can feel the difference.
oh
Like
yeah,
we've got tracks, where we drive back and forth a good bit. And so that's bare, because we've kind of killed the grass there. And then you just go to the edge of that where the grass is thin and it's still hard. But you go over another foot, where there's grass growing, there's a good armor on that soil, and it's so much softer. It's it's
yeah.
it's
Well,
absolutely unbelievable. And it doesn't seem to matter what time of year it is.
and you've used a penetrometer, something that measures the amount of force needed
Yep.
to push a probe into the ground. And we, as sheep producers, it's not a common piece of equipment that we have laying in the barn. But we do have step-in posts, and so I challenge everybody's found that hard ground putting
Yep.
out step-in posts or a T post or whatever it is, and then you know where to put that post.
Yep.
If I need it to go in the ground and I'm struggling, we find that ground with the lush grass, and all of a sudden it slips right down in there. But when we're thinking about soil armor, ultimately leaving that cover, when we think about grass or forage on top of that surface, it operates as a mat, and then also, is it rigid? When the grass hits that, it's absorbing all of the energy
Yep.
being produced by that raindrop falling via gravity. And so, I mean, that's a huge aspect of it. And I feel like we've
You know,
covered.
the other part of that too is, we always think about keeping that soil cooler. In the winter months, it keeps that soil warmer.
Right, right.
Really does, because that cold air can't get in there to start to freeze those water molecules in that soil. And so I've heard as well that your soil biology will continue to work in the upper 30s and low 40s of that soil
Right.
temperature.
When just like everything else, we have a range of kind of optimum, a
Yep.
working range of temperature. Too hot, not good. Too cold, it's not good. So uh, that's a great point. We can
I
keep.
know when I was grazing cows, um, I'd have a front fence and a back fence, and I'd have a second front fence ahead of the first front fence. But I could easily put those step in posts in in below freezing temps. Had no problem with them at all. But the cows would eat all the grass, and they would kind of go under that wire a little bit, with their heads. And when I'd go to pull those posts out, they'd be frozen in the ground. Just because they'd taken that grass off, and that allowed that. And I didn't have enough soil armor on then, but allowed that ground to freeze. And it was
Right.
amazing that you could easily put a post in the ground, but you had a hard time getting them back out after a 24-hour period because they had frozen in because the cows took that grass off, took that soil armor off. Now, once we got once we got to where I was smart enough to really be tramping grass down, I wasn't doing so much of that in the winter because I was really trying to ration things, but that kind of changed. And the only time I have trouble getting a post in is if it happens to be in a wet spot where all that water has frozen. The soil hasn't really frozen; it's just the water had frozen. But you look around for those big clumps of grass, and you can stick a post right down in the center of those big clumps because there's enough armor there to keep that soil from freezing.
So here's a question for you. And again, not supposed to be a trick question, but
It will.
as it relates solely, it might be, as it relates solely to soil armor, so none of the other soil health principles, does our soil armor or our cover need to be green? Does it need to be growing grass? And where I'm getting at is if we're doing some renovation on some pasture, and say we go with a fall seeded oat, for example, that we know winter kills, uh, does that still provide soil armor? I guess what's your take on something like that as opposed to, we'll say, an annual ryegrass or a cereal rye that would remain green for the majority of time and maybe even get some growth later on in the season, early in the season. Just what's your thought?
Yeah, I think just from the soil armor point of view, either one is a soil armor. But
Okay.
you start getting into other principles, and one of which is keep a living plant there as much as
Right.
possible,
Right.
and
Right.
that becomes different. But yeah, as far as soil armor, I think a living plant would be better, but it's sure better. Either one of those is better than having just bare soil.
Right. Now, do you feel, using those examples, if we have a plant that maybe winter kills, and this is specific to soil health, so if we pull the grazing aspect out of it for a minute, um, do you feel one that has more mass? Do you feel more soil armor is better, or uh, do you go with one that maybe gives you more animal performance uh, longer into the season?
Well, you just say you were taking grazing out of it.
Answer it how you want to.
Well, now you confuse me. Uh, I don't know. I think it kind of depends what your goal is of whatever it was you planted in the first place. I see lots of guys planting rye um, into standing corn with the idea that they're going to come back in the next year and they're going to plant, they're going to knock that rye down and use that as a mat and plant corn right into that. They're using a roller crimper to knock that down. Now you have to wait till that gets into head, or because you need that stem to get somewhat so that you can snap that stem, and it's not gonna get hollow enough to do that until it's into head. But yeah, I think that's I like the idea of the green plant better than something that's dead. But either way, you got to have something out there. Now being
Right.
grazers, we definitely like the green plant better than we like the dead stuff. But as far as soil health, it just depends what you need. If your soil, I mean, that's one of the other things I do when I'm grazing is there are times that I'm tramping down nice green grass, and there's times that I'm tramping down stuff that's gotten way ahead of me. And when you tramp down that more dead, mature grass, you're pushing that whole system towards a fungal basis. And when you're tramping down the green stuff, you're pushing the whole system towards a bacterial basis. And hey, they tell me that you want to keep that ratio, bacterial to fungal, about 1 to 1. But I can see fields where we've always gotten to them kind of late, where we're really tramping stuff down, and you're seeing a lot more woody species coming out of there. You're starting to see little trees pop up, some of your multiflora roses, those kind of things. And I've kind of made a note for those fields that I need to be tramping more green down to kind of push that fungal out and encourage more of the bacteria.
Yeah, and I do think there's some physical
Biology.
to talk about what you just mentioned because it does relate back to that soil armor because we're talking about cover. Regardless of what color it is preventing all of those things that we have talked about that we've hit on so far. When we start to bring it back, and this is the hard thing is as a producer, as a sheep producer, also paying attention to the soil health aspect. We can't just focus on animal performance on grass. We also can't just think about soil health. I'm of the opinion, and I'm sure there are people that would disagree with that and say, well, if I focus on this, everything follows. And I'm of the opinion that is not the case. We have to be intentional on selection, intentional on those production practices, on all of those aspects to really have something that is working together as perfectly as we can make it. But just the physical attributes of what you're talking about, dropping the bacterial and fungal aspects out of it. One of the advantages to or reasons we add in or want to provide cover that soil armor is to prevent weeds from popping up in that field. If we limit the amount of bare ground, we're also limiting the amount of that seed bank's ability to pop up and produce less beneficial species. Correct?
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. The earth
Yeah.
does everything it can to cover itself constantly. If you just take a bare field, it's not going to come up in just beautiful green grass. It's going to because green grass grows slower than weeds do. So that the first thing that earth is going to try to do is to get itself covered, and it's going to use those weed seeds because they grow fast.
When
And
I even look at it from the opposite side of it, is that weed seed has developed over time, has adapted over time to find a way to survive. That's why they're pestilent. That's why they're weeds. That's why they keep coming up. And so, like, they are opportunistic parasites, if you will, on our pasture. And so my question is, when we're trampling, is there an argument or a real thought process on saying, if we graze the 4 inches for all of the reasons that we already know, but we don't graze more than say 24 inches because we're then suppressing beneficial species with that trample, and then all of a sudden we only get species that are coming up that are willing to compete. And so all of a sudden we take something that their life cycle maybe is a little bit longer, we get a little bit taller, and end up with a less diverse grazing allotment, grazing species out there that are more, say, like tall fescue. This is a primary example for us. I know some ground that we've let go longer than our normal rotation. It's choked out just about everything. So my question is, when is there an optimum cover that we're trying to leave after? Is it just minimum covering up bare soil?
well, it's a bit of a loaded question. The I've been told since the very beginning that you will get what you graze for. Meaning, if you continuously overgraze, you're going to get tons of weeds. If you want to get rid of tall fescue, then you need to change your grazing habits so that tall fescue isn't isn't left to its own devices where it can just continually take over. And I think that's where maybe on your shorter rest periods, you could work with that, trying to knock back some of that tall fescue.
I
But I
think you have
know,
to leave.
but I know that with the grazing that I have done in all these years, um, what benefits sheep really seems to benefit soil health. We don't want to be coming back in that 25, 30 days too often to graze sheep because we know parasites are just waiting to kill them. And it's also bad for soil health. So it's also bad for the whole, grass cycle. And I think that's the other part of it too, is we always talk about grazing. We're always thinking about grasses. And it's not just grasses. There's grasses, there's legumes, there's forbs, there's lots of stuff in there. And I don't get too concerned about weeds as long as my sheep are eating them. And as long as I can
For
track them down too, because that just means more stuff that you're feeding the microbes in the soil.
Right. I think that's my main thought is if we're just focused on say going in and grazing 24 long rest period, we go in and graze, we get the trample, but then we're creating this mat that is not beneficial to some of our legume species or not beneficial to
Well, I can
some of
tell you
our
this, it's been my observation that when I get a good trample, when I've got, something there to really trample, I don't see many weeds popping up through it. But what I do see are very young sprouts of grass, or yeah, of grasses. And almost always I'm getting a really good stand of clover popping up through there. Because remember now,
yeah.
your clover doesn't like the competition. So that it seems as though with that mat being there, it doesn't seem to think of that as being competition as much as it thinks it's an opportunity to grow because it pops itself up through that mat. There's not a whole lot around it.
Right. And I do think clover is an exception. I mean, we go out right now and we start spreading clover. Yeah, we go back to the hopefully everybody's tried to broadcast, frost seed
Yeah.
some clovers out in their pasture. I remember a research project I was working on in West Virginia. It was 2 pounds to the acre. In
Hmm.
my mind, it's like that's not enough to. We won't see a difference. And year one, decent inclusion. Year two, it was about a 50-50 mix. And
Yeah.
so, without diving into the plant physiology and growth pattern. Like clover, I feel like is an exception. Clover is a hardy plant
Yep.
and it stays in the soil and reseeds itself. That is the one legume that I feel really, even if you're a poor grazer, you know, red clover doesn't care. Red clover at least, or our clovers are at least somewhat forgiving to to poor grazers if we give it the rest that it needs. But it would be interesting to see just the as if we were to start to implement these soil practices, what's the relationship to speciation later on? So if I'm leaving longer rest periods, if I'm getting the trample that I need on this pasture, or I feel I need leaving cover, do we start to change species that are present? Do we even if they're beneficial,
Sure you.
do we have cool season grasses that all of a sudden show up and stay around uh, because of the way that we're grazing?
Well, that's
But
that's one of the big things I've noticed is I don't really have much of a summer slump, and I firmly believe it's because we're keeping those soils so much cooler. And it's
oh yeah,
those cool
yeah,
season grasses just continue to come.
right.
They'll definitely slow down, but it's not that drastic slump that I've heard so many people talk about through the years that you have to have a warm season grass in there to make up the difference. We've not we haven't noticed that at all since we started doing this. And I think 10 years ago, yeah, you definitely saw it in the beginning, but now you very rarely see it. So we're coming up on our time here, Cam. We were going to try to cover all five of these. We got through one.
Good discussion. Yeah,
I
it's
think,
important stuff, and again, as sheep producers, there are things I feel we know are good, but are we willing to implement them, and do we know the nitty gritty on our forage production out on pasture and what's really again at the root of it?
yep,
So it's a good discussion.
I think so. So we thank you for listening to the Grazing Sheep podcast. If you want to reach out to us, you can do that by contacting me at bigtomperkins@gmail.com. I will say I've got about 5 or 6 in my email box right now that I need to get back to. Been just kind of mulling over the answers, and so I'm a little
Maybe
slow.
we'll do a Christmas questionnaire episode.
There you go. And there's also a Facebook page. You can go on there and like and follow. So don't forget, what is it? The Ohio Grazing Conference is coming up here in a month. I'll be speaking at that, so come on out, say hi, and there'll be a donation jar there. You can throw a couple dollars in.
Yeah, great, great. Are you taking the keyboard with you then? You gonna play
No,
out front?
no, no. You're not going to do any singing. Just talking. So, so it's been good catching up with you, Cam, and you have a good week there, buddy.
You too, Tom.
All right. Bye.